Welcome. I think it's now time to start. I see that the number of participants is increasing as people are connecting. Thank you so much for joining our conversation today. It's really a pleasure to see so many people from very different locations to connect with us for this discussion. And we are particularly happy as we organized this online event together with UNCTAD colleagues. And we will discuss today about trade integration and NTMs, non-tariff measures, across ASEAN and East Asia. ERIA has been working on these issues since its establishment, since the very beginning of ERIA journey. So there is a lot of information and analysis that the organization has put together on this specific topic. And it's also a topic where there is a very good collaboration with UNCTAD, and this is why we are here together to discuss with you about this very important topic for the region and elsewhere, actually. So I was mentioning these many reports because we will discuss also about a joint publication, joint work between the two organizations, ERIA and UNCTAD. We will also share some resources through the chat box, different reports and relevant links. So please keep an eye on that. Also because we want to interact with you, we cannot interact with you in the normal way, but feel free to use the chat box to leave questions for the speakers as we will come back to your questions during the Q&A at the end of the webinar. But now it's time to start the real conversation. And I would immediately introduce Koji Achiyama, Chief Operating Officer of ERIA, and Ralph Peters, Chief of Section at UNCTAD, who will deliver introductory remarks. Achiyama-san, Koji Achiyama, is the Chief Operating Officer of ERIA, and he started his career in the Ministry of International Trade and Industry in Japan in 1992, and served in various positions, including at the Embassy of Japan in Indonesia from 1997 to 2001, before coming back to Indonesia recently at ERIA. Before joining ERIA, he served as a counselor in the National Strategy Office of ICT in the Cabinet Secretariat of Japan. And from 2014 to 2017, he served as the director of the IT department in JETRO, New York, and the head of the New York representative office of IPA, Japan's Information Technology Promotion Agency. He obtained his bachelor and master degree in engineering from Tokyo Institute of Technology, Japan. It's also a great pleasure to have with us Ralph Peters, who's the chief of UNCTAD Trade Information Section of the Trade Analysis Branch Division on International Trade in Goods and Services and Commodities. He's in charge of the program on trade control measures, including non-tariff measures. He was in UNCTAD working closely with developing countries on the WTO Doha Rounds negotiation on agriculture and non-agriculture market access. And he was also a chief technical advisor at the ILO for Trade and Employment. Before he joined the UN, he was project coordinator at the Center for European Economic Research and assistant professor in economics. He has a master's degree in economic mathematics and holds a PhD in economics. Thank you very much. I would now invite Mr. Koji Achiyama to deliver his remarks. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Julia. Dr. Ralph Peters, Dr. Lily Young, and respected speakers, Professor Simon Evenett, Dr. Denise Penello Rial, our economist, Dr. Doan Ha, and national team leaders. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First, I'm delighted to share with you that United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, and we ERIA have established database and conducted analysis on non-tariff measures called NTMs in East Asia. This work could only be done with great effort and dedication from national teams and, of course, strong support from the governments. The NTM database and reports are available for the 10 ASEAN countries and its main trading partners, Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea. Second, with a great honor, I'm pleased to inform you that the ASEAN's NTM database and reports developed by UNCTAD and ERIA was officially handed over to the ASEAN member states at the ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting last year. The database has been endorsed by ASEAN countries to serve as a primary resource for member states to populate and develop the NTM sections of their national trade repositories. Similarly, the database and reports of net NTMs in Australia, China, India, Japan, and New Zealand, and Republic of Korea can also be considered so. Indeed, the database and reports can serve as an independent and credible source for multiple stakeholders, for academia to conduct evidence-based research, for policymakers to better manage NTMs, and for business to get free access on trade regulations. The database and reports are publicly available from our website. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, in current challenging economic situation caused by COVID-19 pandemic and increasing uncertainties of trade policies, I have to emphasize more than ever on the importance of strengthening economic integration by improving the quality of regulations and removing unnecessary barriers to trade. The signing of the RCEP by 15 leaders reaffirmed such a commitment in this region. The ERIA, UNCTAD, NTM database and reports are just the beginning. Governments, business, academia, we all need to work together toward more coordinated efforts in streamlining NTM standard harmonization and mutual recognition to further facilitate trade. I wish you all enjoy the discussion as much as we enjoy crafting the database and reports. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I would immediately give the floor to Ralph Peters. Ralph, please unmute. Oh, yes.
Can you hear me? Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Julia. Dear Mr. Koji Harijama, distinguished speakers, distinguished guests, I'd also like to welcome you. And I would like to congratulate all 15 participating countries that have concluded the RCEP negotiations. This is a remarkable achievement with such a high number of participating countries and such a high share of global GDP and trade internationally. So this is really a remarkable achievement. The United Nations is a strong supporter of economic cooperation. So we think that trade is an enabler for sustainable development, and that's why we are very positive about this achievement. We have supported the negotiations with ERIA by collecting data on non-tariff measures. And this was an effort that was quite important. Non-tariff measures include both traditional trade policy instruments, such as quotas, but it also includes technical measures such as sanitary and phytosanitary measures and technical barriers to trade, which have the objective to protect the safety and the health and the environment, but nonetheless, those measures have a significant impact on trade. UNCTAD is leading the global effort to enhance the transparency in these non-tariff measures because they are hidden in legal texts from different agencies of several ministries in countries. So they're not easily accessible by policymakers or traders. The ASEAN region, as well as most countries that have now signed the RCEP agreement, have been a white spot on our map. So we didn't have data for a long time for these countries. And it was the initiative by ERIA that made changing this picture. So we have started in 2014 with ERIA to collect systematically all non-tariff measures in for the 10 ASEAN countries. And I would really like to highlight the excellent partnership between ERIA and UNCTAD that have made this possible. And I would like to highlight the role of Dr. Lily Yang-Ing, who has really, with a very strong commitment, moved this agenda ahead. A few years later, we updated all ASEAN countries, and we have also gotten into the collection of all 6 RCEP negotiating parties outside of ASEAN, of which 5 now signed the agreement. And that was quite a significant effort. There are countries that have really many non-tariff measures, complicated non-tariff measures. So I think this is a remarkable database that we have done together with ERIA, having systematically available all the information by measures, by products. My colleagues will get into the details later on. So I would like to welcome everybody for the discussion today, and I'm really grateful for this excellent partnership with ERIA. We are looking forward to continue working very closely with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Now let's start with the introduction to the speakers that will deliver presentations today before the Q&A. So we have with us my colleague, Dr. Doan Thanh. She's an economist at ERIA in Jakarta. Her research interests include many different topics, such as industrial organization, but also international trade, labor market, and income distribution. She has been working extensively on productivity improvement of the private sector in selected East Asian countries, among many different projects. She's also coordinating a capacity building program in collaboration with UNCTAD experts for ASEAN government officials on non-tariff measures. And before joining ERIA, Dr. Doan was a research associate at the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo, and she was also a short-term consultant for the OECD. Together with her in the presentation, we are very happy to have Denise Penello Rial from UNCTAD. She holds a Master in Economics from DTEA University and a Master's degree in Economic Development from Universidad Carlos III in Madrid. She has worked in trade and development in UNCTAD for 9 years, and she's worked on NTM as part of the team that developed the NTM classification. She has also researched, implemented technical assistance, and advised countries in trade policy linked to development, and more recently in aligning and harmonizing policies in NTM with a view to regional integration, paying special attention to trade facilitation practices and procedure that may interact with behind-the-border regulation. And prior joining UNCTAD, she worked in the UN Regional Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC. It's also a great pleasure to have with us Professor Simon Everett, who is Professor of International Trade and Economic Development and MBA Director at the University of St.Gallen, Switzerland. At the start of the global financial crisis, Simon created the Global Trade Alert Initiative, the leading independent monitor of protectionism and commercial policy choice based at the University of St. Gallen. Simon regularly engages with the private sector practitioners, governmental officials, and leaders, and he has taught at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford, the Ross School of Business, the University of Michigan, and Rutgers University. He has served as the World Bank official twice, and he has been a non-resident senior fellow in the Economic Studies program of the Brookings Institution, and also a member of the UK Competition Commission. He was the DLA Piper Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Carey School of Business, John Hopkins University, and he holds a PhD in Economics from Yale University and the Bachelor in Economics from the University of Cambridge. Thank you very much to all speakers for being with us. And now I think we are going to watch a short video on NTMs. Please start projecting the video. Thank you.
Most people have heard of tariffs, taxes on imported goods that have declined in number as free trade agreements have proliferated around the world. However, while tariffs have been declining, non-tariff measures have increased. But what exactly are non-tariff measures? And why are they important? Non-tariff measures are policy measures other than tariffs that can have an economic effect on international trade, affecting the quantities traded or the prices or both. NTMs are introduced for a variety of reasons. They often have non-trade objectives, such as protecting public health or the environment, or ensuring food quality. They can be a tool in efforts to achieve sustainable development goals. Unlike tariffs, NTMs can play a role of checks and balances to ensure the quality of goods. However, they can also have restrictive and distorting effects on international trade. According to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, NTMs are 3 times more restrictive than existing tariffs. They disproportionately affect smaller enterprises and poorer countries because of their implications for market access and the higher compliance and procedural costs involved. Understanding the uses and implications of NTMs is crucial for the formulation and implementation of effective development strategies. Access to information is a significant challenge and a reason why there is little understanding about NTMs. NTMs are complex. Their effects are often indirect and case-specific. Gathering of relevant data is often difficult and costly. For this reason, there was an urgent need to develop better understanding and transparency. ERIA collaborated with UNCTAD to collect and classify NTMs in the 10 ASEAN countries, with the aim of creating a standardized, high-quality, comprehensive NTM dataset for the region. Together, ERIA and UNCTAD made this data available on trains. This NTM database provides information on a broad range of policy instruments. The database is a systematic source of information and aims to enhance the transparency of NTMs. The database provides data on country coverage, number of regulations, products, and measures. It explains terminology and allows you to search by country, period, and type of measure, and to output data for reference and analysis. The NTM database is designed to help achieve the goal of mutual recognition and harmonization, contributing to more transparency and better implementation of NTMs, and better trade and investment policy and regulations. To learn more, visit the NTM database at eria.org.
Excellent. Very good short video produced by our colleagues. And now I think we can start with the first presentation of Ha and Denise. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm muted. No, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for this opportunity to share the work that we're doing. Thank you to ERIA again for the organization of this event. Today we are presenting part of the work carried out jointly with ERIA between UNCTAD and ERIA. One is a report on data for Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, and Republic of Korea, it has been said before, and the other is all 10 ASEAN countries. These are presented in 2 separate publications, but there is only one single framework behind both. So the data for all these countries were constructed in the same way. I will first concentrate on the framework for this specific work, the why and the how we're doing this, and then Ha will later present overview of statistic results for computing the incidence measures on the use of these policies. So these regulations and that converted into statistics, and then you can see the pattern of the use of these policies by different countries and regions. So the full data is then available for consultation at product level. And then most of the authors, the data collectors, and the team leaders are present here also for questions afterwards. Next slide, please. In the next slide, I want to pick up a few of the images from the video that we just presented. The NTMs are introduced for a variety of reasons that are often non-trade related at all. So they have objectives such as, protecting public health or the environment or ensuring food quality. And they can also be a tool in achieving Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. So why are we talking about NTMs in trade if they're not related? The thing is that the NTMs affect the cost of trade. They can affect the quantities traded, for example, because of higher compliance cost. There could be less exporters because less companies are able to comply with a certain requirement, or else they become more expensive to produce because of they have to respect higher standards for safety, for example. In this way, the NTMs can restrict trade, or they can distort trade if there are less efficient traders who can then comply to the requirements and get market access instead. So this results that the implementation of the NTMs normally affect the smaller companies and the poor countries more than the rest. And this is why the NTMs are relevant for development, and then governments should pay attention to the possible impact within the countries. Next slide, please. Now, this video also reflects the motivation we had for this work. It's the access for information that is so difficult and costly. When we started the work, there was really very little information years back on this area. And if there is little transparent, systematic, and comparable information, then there is little understanding of the impacts that they may have. We can only understand what are the impacts once we have the data on what are the NTMs in place. We have good information for tariffs, and we can do analysis with that, but we do not have such good and complete information for non-tariffs. So the objective is to have standardized information across countries and as updated as possible, of course. We can talk about updating of the data then later. Next slide, please. Two areas that we always stress in the database is comprehensiveness and neutrality. Those are the principles of the database that we are producing. Comprehensiveness means that we collect all the measures. And when we say we collect all the measures, we do not mean that we collect information on trade barriers. It's not the case. One key aspect of this work is the transparency work, is to have information that is comprehensive, and that means without any judgment of whether those policies are good or bad, whether they are barriers or if they are justified and legitimate trade policy measures. So neutrality comes hand in hand with comprehensiveness. We do not start the work with a prejudgment, collecting, the ones that will be a problem. We collect everything, and everything means all the requirements for export and for import that are in place in a point in time for a country. And we base this on official regulations. We go to the official legislation of a country that is in force in a certain moment, and we base the data collection on that. Some of the regulations may be easy to comply with, and some others maybe not. We do not know beforehand, and then the database does not say that either. This comes only after analysis, and we first collect the data, and once we have everything, then we can do analysis and then point where there could be the possible difficult areas. This is why it was decided to collect data in a neutral approach without any judgment of the impact or the legitimacy that it may have. And we share this data with the public as it is for transparency purposes. In fact, to tell apart what NTM could be a barrier or an obstacle is not something that is necessarily intrinsic to the measure at all times. The same requirement, for example, may be easily complied to by some countries or by some companies, and normally the biggest ones, while the same requirement could be very difficult to comply with for others, and it could become a barrier for some small companies. Our analysis suggests that normally it's less developed countries and smaller companies who suffer the most from the cost of the NTMs in trade. Next slide, please. In the next slide, I type as a screenshot of a website. If you type in your browser the words UNCTAD and NTM, the first option most likely is the NTM hub. There you have access to all the information, the documents, the data. And the map that you see there is marking in blue the countries for which we have data. So you can see it's beyond the region. This is a global initiative, and the logos in the image are all our implementation partners, the financial partners, the knowledge partners. So we work with regional and other partners in different places. Not only this is more effective and efficient, we believe, but it also ensures that there will be synergies among different institutions that are working in similar areas of work, incorporating different perspectives, for example, the regional perspectives. So we go to the next slide. In the next slide, we show the list of regional partners. So in Asia, we are working very closely with ERIA, as it was said. So we can go to the next slide. Here I'm showing the list of the chapters of the classification. I would also like to highlight the conceptual work that was done years back, because it is funding work. We took a long time to discuss very deeply with all the international agencies that you see mentioned in the image there. This group of agencies was called the MAST group. It's the MAST, Multi-Agency Support Team. And after a lot of effort and long discussions, we arrived finally to an agreement on what would be the taxonomy or the classification of different types of measures. They are broadly organized in chapters. The list of the chapters are seen in the image. And after this first step, having one common classification means having one common language to talk about NTMs, and we find this important. This classification is being adopted by more and more institutions, the African Development Bank, ALADI in Latin America, ERIA of course, but also WTO and OECD are using our classification. So this classification is divided in chapters named with letters A to I for the import NTMs. For example, the first chapter is the SPS, so we record information on the prohibitions for sanitary reasons, as well as authorization requirements for the products, the traders, whenever they are necessary to export into a country. We also record hygiene processes for production, as well as post-harvest treatment, such as fumigation, for example. The database also contains information on testing, certification, inspection, traceability, and many others. We also collect information for conformity assessment for TBT, and a similar list is also available for TBT, which is the chapter B, the second one. There are also export measures in the last line. The export measures are the requirements that the country imposes on its own exports. For example, to register as an exporter or to pay a fee for every export. The export measures are contained in the last chapter. This happens to be a lot of export measures, probably a bit more than we have initially expected. Then we have other chapters for which we are not actively collecting data yet. For example, distribution restrictions or rules of origin, and then subsidies, government procurement, and intellectual property. For these last three, we have completed the classification together with the MAST group a year ago, or year and a half, and data is probably going to be collected in a different way, for example, without naming the products for each measures. In some cases, it's impossible, for example, for IP. If we go to the next slide. In the next slide, I describe a little bit how the process of data collection takes place. There is another publication which we call the guidelines. And these are guidelines for data collectors that have the purpose to harmonize the NTM data collection process and to minimize the uncertainty during the process of categorization of measures and classification. So we train the data collectors so that the output would be standardized. Then we also do quality verification of the data before publishing as well. The data collection starts, the first step is reading the regulation to extract the measures after. So the same data collection process was followed by each of the team in every country, and the analysis is carried out in similar manner also. The final data is incorporated in the global NTM database and publicly available, so that to the extent possible, the data is comparable across countries. So the data collectors, the first thing they do is to look for the regulations related to the trade in each country. They would collect all the regulations that affect trade at the border, behind the border, in their countries. And then they go through every regulation, the legal text, and read them to identify all the independent requirements for import and for exports. Those are the NTMs. And then we may count how many of those we have. But the last step, it's important also, is to associate each NTM, each requirement, with the list of protocols that each one affects. Some NTMs are broader and they affect many products, or even all of them, all the traded products in a country, while other NTMs are narrower in the regulatory scope and they affect, for example, one or very few products. So in that way, NTMs could be different. One notable feature of this NTM database is that all the mapped NTM legal requirements are associated with all the individual tariff line codes or HS6 level products. And this is important. This is a source, we believe, of immense value, not only for traders that may look up in the database what are the NTMs in a certain country for the precise product they are exporting, but also for the regulators who want to know all the simultaneous regulations that are enforced in their country, for example, for this or that sector of regulatory interest to them. We go to the next slide, please. And this is my last slide. This is a screenshot of a new portal to access the data, our dissemination portal. It will be ready very soon. The data at the moment is presently available through TRAIN's database and also through the WITS database of the World Bank. The same data is also disseminated in the Global Trade Help Desk that was launched together by UNCTAD and ITC and WTO in Geneva. It picks the same data. It's published through different portals. So we are now developing this tailor-made portal to disseminate the data that suits the characteristics of this data very well. It will be one database. It's a one-stop shop with standardized methodology. Quality check is also centralized, and this methodology is applied to all countries alike. At the moment, we have like more than 90 countries. Lastly, I would like to say that we're concerned with the benefits and the problems related to the NTMs, and we would also like to see that the discussions globally are more and more based on solid data now that we are starting to have this data available. This data is useful for both statistical analysis, and we will see a hint now in a minute, but also to study in depth case by case to assess the benefits of the regulations and the cost as well. These NTMs, for example, can be used as a starting point to review the effectiveness and efficiency of the NTMs affecting key sectors of the economy, so that we can ensure the minimal cost possible to trade. And then last but not least, I would like to mention that the TRAIN's database can be used as the main source for information for a trade portal or trade repository. And highlight again that the characteristics is neutrality, comprehensiveness, and standardization. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I hand over to you now.
Yeah, can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much, Denise. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for your interest and participation in this event. As my colleague from UNCTAD, Denise, has just mentioned, this NTM database is an intensive effort where we have been embarking on for the last 6 or 7 years. It requires the contribution and support from a very big team, the technical support from ERIA and UNCTAD, our consultants for 16 countries, the government officials, and for ASEAN, we also receive lots of support from ASEAN-related bodies on trade facilitation and standards. So Ms. Denise has mentioned various ways that the database can be utilized for various purposes, for academic analysis, or for government officials, for policymakers. And the advantage of this database compared to some other existing sources is its comprehensiveness. In particular, we have the HS code at the most detailed level, that is the national tariff line. Then with each product, we have various types of NTMs imposed on. We have the country, whether it's bilateral, whether it's unilateral, and then we have the text. So it can serve it can serve the interest of various a group of people, for businesses, for government policymakers, and for researchers alike. In the next slides, I would like to present some of the ways that the data could be used. It could serve as a starting point to discuss about the NTM issues, to seek further collaboration. And it's fact-based because it's collected independently by our consultants. So let me start first with a few aggregated statistics that we computed for the ASEAN +6 countries. +6 here, I mean the members, ASEAN and its partner in the regions, Australia, China, Japan, New Zealand, Korea, and India. As you can see here, this table presents the number of NTMs that each country applies. The data collection year for ASEAN was in 2018, and the data for the rest countries was just published recently. As you can see here, the very first observation that emerges is that countries applied hundreds to thousands of NTMs. That means NTM is everywhere. Even though they may not necessarily be bad in the sense that they are imposed with a protectionist intent, the mere large number of NTM could act as a potential barrier to trade if they are not well designed and implemented. And one important point I would like to note here that when you look at the number across countries, there's a tendency to compare the number, but simply by looking at this number of NTMs, we cannot say anything about the restrictiveness or the stringency of NTMs that each country impose, because of the difference in the way NTMs are designed. And also for this NTM count, we do not take into account the number of products affected. We only count the number of requirements. For example, you see here some countries have a few hundreds, like Brunei, Cambodia, or Indonesia, or Myanmar, when other countries may have up to thousands, like China, India, Thailand, New Zealand. But again, it just shows that with this mere number, if not well designed and implemented, it could create extra burdens for firms to export and import. And please avoid the direct comparison across countries. Now, the second observation that emerges is that the technical measures, the SPS and TPT, account for the majority of NTMs in place, ranging from around 60% to 80% of the total number of NTMs. But this observation is in line with the global application of NTMs in other developed countries that have where the data is available. But one interesting observation that we see here is that the export-related measures that the NTMs applied on the country's own exports is also quite high in several countries. For example, in Laos, in Vietnam, or in Cambodia, it accounts for up to 30% of the total number of NTMs. So we haven't talked about the stringency yet, but with this mere number, with this associated administrative procedure, if not well implemented, it could create, could add significant trade costs to the firms and could impede trade flows. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we go a bit further into looking into the product level. So in the previous statistic, I only showed the number of NTMs without taking into account the number of products that they affect. This figure shows the incidence and prevalence of import NTMs in the 16 countries. I present here 3 statistics that are often used to show as a starting point to discuss about the prevalence of NTMs. That is the frequency index, the coverage ratio, and the prevalence score. The frequency index shows the number of traded product affected by at least 1 NTM. So say if the country imports 100 products and 95 products are subject to at least 1 NTM, then the frequency index would be 95%, 0.95. The frequency index does not take into account the trade value that these products presented. So the coverage ratio overcomes this weakness by measuring the trade value affected by at least 1 NTM. So if these 95 products account for about 80% of the traded value, then we say the coverage ratio is 80%. And finally, the red dot, the prevalence score, shows the average number of NTM applied on 1 product. What emerged from this statistic, from this figure, is that NTMs are applied are very popular in all countries. We see that the frequency index and the coverage ratio for NTMs in all countries are very high, ranging from around 30% to up to almost 100%, meaning that almost every product is subject to NTMs. And the coverage ratio is even higher, meaning that NTMs are more likely to be imposed on trade-intensive products. For the prevalence score, we also see a number from somewhere around 2 measures per product up to 10 measures per product, suggesting significant added trade cost if not well designed and implemented. Next slide, please. Now for export NTMs, we see a similar picture. The indicators values are lower, but still significant. And in this case, we see the coverage ratio that is much larger than the frequency index for some countries. Also, there's a wide range of prevalence of NTMs, ranging from somewhere around 20% to almost 90%. So we also see a similar picture, although the extent is smaller than import. The statistics are still very much significant. Next, please. Now, if we break down the NTMs, not by country, but by product group, then what we observe here is the prevalence and the high prevalence and incidence of NTMs in the agricultural products. Almost 100% of imported agri-food is subject to NTMs. This is not something worrying on the one hand, because food safety is one major concern. But on the other hand, if it could potentially be trade impeding, especially for small firms in developing countries who often complain about the over-restrictive NTMs in developed countries. And for the other product groups, the natural resources and manufacturers, although the incidence and prevalence are smaller, it's still quite significant. The frequency index of natural resource and manufacturers for export is around 40 to 60%, and for import is over 60%. And the coverage ratio is much higher, about 80% in the case of import, and in the case of export, about 40 to 80%. Next, please. Now, if we're looking by chapters, as suggested in the first table that I presented, the technical measures are more frequently used than the other types. Particularly here, we're talking about SPS and TBT. The pre-shipment is not that popular. And the SPS measures have the highest prevalence score, meaning that the SPS, the number of SPS per NTM, per product is highest among all NTM measures. And as you can see, it's closely related to the agricultural products. Next, please. Although as this figure shows the breakdown of frequency index, coverage ratio, and prevalence score by product and by broad NTM type, technical versus non-technical measures. In general, technical measures tend to have a more clear-cut objectives compared to non-technical measures, which in some cases are not clear-cut in terms of the objectives applied. Again, what we see is agri-food products are highly regulated, both by technical and non-technical measures. You see the frequency index around 90 to 100%. And the number of NTMs per product, the prevalence score is also quite high, over 15 measures per product for technical measures, and for non-technical, around probably 2 measures per product. We also observe that for manufacturers, the TBT is more prevalent, but also the licenses in Chapter 8, that is for ASEAN, for example, we see that non-automatic licensing is among the top NTMs applied on imports. And also the export measures, as I've mentioned earlier, we observe that in some countries in ASEAN, the export-related measure account for about 1/3 of the total number of NTMs. And for developed country, we also observe Australia, who applied about 24% of the total number of NTMs are on export measures rather than import measures. Next, please. Now, so what we can see from these statistics, this is the aggregated statistics, and we need more analysis, in-depth analysis into the product, into the specific regulations in order to derive policy recommendations. But as a starting point, we see that about 70% of NTMs are technical measures which should serve legitimate purposes to protect consumers' health, safety, to protect the environment. Therefore, elimination of NTM is not always an option. And we need to strike a balance to avoid the cost burden. Now, on the pros of NTMs, it serves various public policy purposes. It protects consumers, it ensures the product quality, ensure the safety, to protect the environment. And the cons is that if it's not, NTMs are not well designed, not well implemented, or if it's overly restrictive, it could create significant added burden in terms of trade cost and the time cost for the exporters and importers. As we have shown earlier in the video, estimation by UNCTAD shows that NTMs are 3 times more restrictive than tariffs. And in ASEAN region, our colleague Dr. Lidi Yanning has also made some estimates which shows more or less a similar result, where the cost of NTM is significantly higher than the cost of tariff. So what would be the possible path to move forward with this NTM, given that elimination is not an option? It requires coordination among different ministries, because quite frequently the product is under the supervision and monitoring of various ministries. And good regulatory practice are very important to ensure that NTMs are well designed and well implemented. So that's all for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both Denise and Ha. I think now we can immediately move to the next presentation with Professor Simon Everett.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this webinar. It's a real delight to see the work that ERIA and UNCTAD have been doing in this area. I would like to make 3 points in my presentation. The first is to congratulate ERIA on undertaking this painstaking work to document non-tariff measures. And I'm going to use this opportunity to look at their work and to contrast it with the work on NTMs that the Global Trade Alert does. And I'm going to do that not to be critical, but and this is my second point, to highlight the complementarities between the two initiatives, and to highlight or to point users to one database for one type of information and another database for another type of information. And I would argue, actually, if we were able to use both sets of information, and both are freely available, then we start getting a comprehensive picture of the NTMs which are at work in East Asia and the Pacific. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is, given that we've spent all this time collecting this information, how do we then translate it into having a greater impact with stakeholders? So we should not be naive that the collection of information is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for impact. And we should talk, I think, a bit about how to make this work more impactful with key stakeholders. So this is the purpose of my presentation. I want to begin by saying I looked at the reports that ERIA has put out, and of course they have aligned nicely with the UNCTAD methodology on NTMs, and we've seen, I think, a big step forward in transparency in the policies adopted in the region with, that differ from tariffs. And this increase in transparency is a clear sort of common goal that we share at the Global Trade Alert with colleagues working on NTMs at ERIA and at UNCTAD. I think it's a real step forward in terms of doing that. Now, our colleagues have just described the areas of public policy that they have tracked. And I think it would be fair to say that the ERIA and UNCTAD initiatives do a great job trying to track the SBS and TBT measures. And in fact, when we designed the Global Trade Alert, we decided that because our colleagues in the international organizations were doing such a good job on TBT and SBS, we would not focus on those areas, and instead we would focus on other areas of other NTMs, including in particular subsidies, which you'll see the importance of in a minute. And it's interesting that in the presentations that we've just seen, subsidies have not played a big role, and I will highlight that as a point of difference. One other byproduct of not talking about TBT and SPS is that we are in the global trade alert, we are interested in non-tariff measures which liberalize trade as well as restrict trade. So we don't have to do all these handstands about saying, well, TBT and SPS are necessary public policies and therefore we can't really criticize them that much. By avoiding TBT and SPS, we have actually homed in on policies which we think are trade restrictive and trade improving, and this helps us, I think, have a slightly different presentation and edge to our work. So with that in mind, let me take you to some summary statistics on NTMs in the ASEAN region. And what I have shown in this chart here is the number of NTMs introduced by the ASEAN nations that the Global Trade Alert has been able to document by the 8th of December in each year. And you can see that the number has grown over time and probably reflects some degree of learning by doing. But I suspect it also reflects the fact that governments are turning to NTMs much more now that tariffs are becoming less and less important. And you can see that 2020 stands out as a remarkable year in terms of resort to non-tariff measures, in particular export curbs and constraints, which governments have been using amongst other things. And also we see lots of subsidies, trade distorting subsidies introduced as well this year, worldwide and within the region. But it would be wrong to say that the balance of measures are all negative. We have found 37 NTMs in the ASEAN region which were imposed this year, which liberalize trade or free trade, and these are positive developments as well. So we can see both over time, a growing number of harmful and a growing number of liberalizing measures. Now, our classification of a harmful measure is one that treats foreign commercial interests worse than domestic commercial interests. And our definition of a liberalizing measure is the opposite, that they favor foreign firms over domestic firms. And so as a result, because we don't look at TBT and SPS, we are able to classify many of these policies which are not designed on a national treatment basis. Instead, they're designed deliberately to favor one group of firms over another. Overall, then, we can see that NTMs in ASEAN spiked this year. If you step back and you look at the East Asia and Pacific region in general, you also see a big jump in the resort to NTMs in the last 3 years. And there is indeed a mix between liberalizing and harmful measures, but on net, most of them are harmful. And so this is a growing area of policymaking and one which I believe deserves much more scrutiny. And we should be looking into whether or not these policies are strictly necessary. Again, the statistics here refer to the number of measures introduced each year that we documented by the 8th of December, that is today. So these are essentially apples for apples comparisons of the resort to new policy intervention. And you can see the last 3 years have been particularly active. So this gives you a sense then of why NTMs are important, and I would certainly endorse the view which has been expressed earlier as to why we must track NTMs in the East Asia Pacific region and of course in ASEAN and in RCEP. Now, if you look deeper into the Global Trade Alert database, we too use the mass classification for non-tariff measures. We're very grateful that the UN put that together, and we use that to classify policy interventions as well. And what I've shown you here is the proportion of each year's NTMs in the East Asia and Pacific region that fall into different chapters. Chapter L is subsidies, Chapter P is export measures, Chapter E are quotas and the like, Chapter D is contingent protection measures, and the rest is in black. Now you can see here what the thing that jumps out of this page is the growing bars of red referring to subsidies largely to import competing firms. Now the dip in 2019 and 20 is purely a measurement issue. That is because the information that we gather on subsidies in China tends to be published with a 9-month lag, 9 months to a year lag. And so those shares will rise up higher than what we've seen up until now. But I think you will see one very clear point, which is that subsidies are where the action is. Now, this then helps me make one other point, which is that our colleagues at ERIA and UNCTAD have done a great job looking at TBT and SBS. But for the time being, it seems that the documenting of subsidies has not been a priority. In contrast, in the Global Trade Alert, we didn't make the documenting of subsidies a priority. It just turns out that that's what lots of our team members have found systematically over the years. So I would urge that, for policymakers, for analysts, and for business people in the East Asia Pacific region, maybe you look at the two different data sets for different things. And in that sense, that was the sense in which I argued earlier that they're very complementary and that they have complementary sources of information. So subsidies are a very important matter we find in our work. In terms of trade coverage, what I've done in this particular chart was estimate this morning what is the percentage of, or what is the share of East Asian exports which are at risk from non-tariff measures imposed by other East Asian Pacific nations on imports. And these are, of course, ones which exclude TBT and SBS. So we find that of the measures that are enforced today, about 12% of the imports into the East Asian Pacific region are affected by NTMs other than TBT and SBS. So this gives you a sense of the relative importance. And secondly, the second bar shows you something very different. And that is that in the region, East Asia and the Pacific region, there are a number of governments which offer incentives to exporters. And so this affects the competition in third markets. So for example, if China offers an incentive for its exporters to ship goods to Vietnam, and those goods in Vietnam compete against Australian exports, then this represents a challenge for Australian exporters. So what I have in the right-hand bar is the share of East Asian exports that face NTMs from both the import competing side and from export incentives. And you can see that the share of East Asian and Pacific exports which face those NTMs, this full set of NTMs, then is about 40%. And the gap, of course, between the two indicates just how prevalent export incentives are these days in the global trading system, which is a factor which is unfortunately not discussed as much as it should be in Geneva. So when you look then at export shares, you can see the relative importance of import-related NTMs versus NTMs which are also affecting export dynamics. Let me then come to my second but last slide and reflect then on these findings. Now, the Global Trade Alert has been around for 10 years, in fact, 11 years now. And we have tried not only to collect data, but also to try and get people to use it, to discuss our data, and to try and influence policy debates. And I think the same question that we face is one which ERIA and others face, which is how do we get this, how do we get policymakers and decision makers to look at our data and to be able to think through its implications. And one of the first points which comes across, of course, is how we present and how we talk about the data. And my colleagues before me, distinguish between counts of data versus trade coverage. I have shown both here. I think it's very important that we provide some sense of the economic or business significance of different types of trade measures. And that is done partly by using trade coverage measures, partly by looking at prevalence scores, as our colleagues highlighted, but also by highlighting the impact that we see of these non-tariff measures on trade flows. And this is where the econometric work that UNCTAD has done and others have done, including our team here, has done as well. It's very important that we can provide some sense of the impact of these measures so that policymakers can focus on which ones are more important. And there's two other observations two other opportunities I think we have as well. The first is that this type of work should be informing deliberations in multilateral fora such as UNCTAD, such as the WTO and at the United Nations, and other fora such as the OECD and alike. And I think we need to be more active in doing this. For example, it would be quite possible for the information that ERIA has collected to be used quite extensively in trade policy reviews of governments from the East Asia and Pacific region. And I think that would be an important way in which this data could be used to help shape discussions at the WTO and help governments realize that they will come under some degree of scrutiny now that policy is more transparent. And I think that's a valuable contribution. And then the last area where I think we all have to work a lot harder is to figure out how to present this information in a form that's useful for entrepreneurs and SMEs. And now I say this because I know I'm very well aware of the work that ITCs does, and I'm very well aware of what many national agencies do. But I'm also aware of the fact that most entrepreneurs and SMEs do not have the time to learn about trade policy. They need to have information delivered to them in an extremely user-friendly format. And much of the way in which we do this amongst the trade policy community is not user-friendly, I would suggest. So I think one area where we all have to do some work and also thinking and talking to entrepreneurs is to figure out how to better distribute this information and to talk about its implications for time-pressed executives who have about 1,000 things they have to do before dinner tonight. So I would suggest that these are areas where we need to work a little harder. And I think since we're all in the transparency business, I think we should continue to dialogue on these particular matters. The last thing to say is if you want any more information about what the Global Trade Alert's been finding recently we put out a report on the cross-border fallout from the pandemic and the policy overdrive that it induced. And of course, it covers countries from your region, but it also has global coverage as well. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to the questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Professor Simon. There are already several questions, so I would immediately start to ask our speakers some of the questions that I will a bit recombine and select from the audience, as we have more or less 20 minutes for Q&A. So the first question I would like to ask speakers is about measurement or discussion around regulatory distance or similarities of NTMs between countries. So what that would be a significant factor to analyze whether NTMs are trade impeding or not, and whether there is a way to basically understand if they are very different from one country and another. And I suppose we would like to hear also from you with respect to the ASEAN and East Asia region. I would maybe start to address this question to Denise and Ha, and then we will follow with the opinion from Professor Simon. Denise? Denise, you're on mute.
Okay, now, right. So you mentioned the first question was on regulatory distance. That has not been computed in the publications we just released, but that can be done since we have a link between the regulations and the exact list of products at 6-digit or tariff line level. Then it can be done across countries. So we can see, for example, tables or red apples, how many or which measures they have in this another country, and then see how different the regulatory approaches are for several countries. So that can be done because of the methodology of this database. And then the other question was on?
It was actually about these data sets and how that could be collected. And then, I mean, what that would be a significant factor to analyze whether NTMs are trade impeding or not.
Well, as Professor Evenett pointed out, the impact is assessed through econometric methods. And we are, for example, in our department, we have colleagues that are producing the ad valorem equivalents of the NTMs. And what they do is they differentiate between technical and non-technical measures. So the SPS sensitivity on one side, and then the rest of the NTMs we have in the database on other side. And they're able to compute at HS6 level and bilateral trade the cost in terms of percentage as if it was a tariff, like a tax in percentage. The thing is that we cannot have a value for each individual measure, for each individual requirement. That so far is not possible to be done. What we do when we want to analyze that type of, when we have that type of question, is go in depth, more qualitative studies. So we have recently published a toolkit. It's a cost effectiveness toolkit, and we are starting to apply this in different countries. So in this case, we focus on a certain sector that is important for the economy, and we start from the database and we see which is the list of measures that are applying to that sector in that country, and then we go assessing qualitatively, asking all the stakeholders, private and public, about those measures, how they were designed, why they are in place, how it affects the traders, how much cost or time it takes. And then after that analysis, we are able to develop recommendations, detailed actionable recommendations to the country. So my response would be, when you want to see which are the NTMs that are burdensome, you have to take this type of analysis that goes beyond statistics.
Thank you very much. Now, Ha, have you anything you want to add quickly?
I think Denise have addressed the key issue here. Regarding regulatory distance studies, Dr. Ralph Peters has shared with you the link to ERIA's publication that is co-edited with Dr. Lili Yan Ying. And last year, we also had a project on assessing the impact of NTMs on ASEAN based on our updated database. There are some studies on regulatory distance as well. And I believe that it all shows that regulatory distance, the larger the distance, the more true restrictive impact that we observe. Just to have, to give you a very quick view, we do a very simple measurement looking at the percentage of overlapping NTMs by product level in ASEAN. And we find that on average, only 16% of the NTMs are overlapping across ASEAN countries. In the best cases, like between Malaysia and Singapore, the ratio is around 30%. So it suggests ample room for regional integration and convergence to reduce the trade impeding impact. I think we have here also from the panel, Professor Nabeshima from Waseda University. He has been also, he's an expert on analytical work on NTMs, including regulatory distance. So perhaps he could have a few words. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, Professor, but I hope you can share something with us. Yeah, thank you, Julia.
Okay, Dr. Ha, thank you very much. So I have been working with NTM, with UNCTAD and ERIA for a long time now. And one of the interests I always had was how the dissimilarity of the regulations between two countries actually affect international trade. So, you know, when you talk about differences in regulations, I think there are a number of different ways that you can calculate. And in this particular way that I'm taking is to look at how, for each commodity, how much of we represent the regulation as a vector, and basically how different direction, how much of the different directions the regulations are looking at. That's how we are defining the dissimilarity between two countries in terms of the regulations. And we have the analytical work done. the paper, I think, will be published soon. It has been accepted to a journal. But what we find was that the dissimilarity, basically how we define dissimilarity here is the additional requirements that the exporter face. Does that going to have any negative impacts on international trade? And we actually do find that it does have negative impact on international trade. And we also look at it from the developing countries to developed countries exports. And there we also find that there is a significant negative impacts on bilateral trade. So I think, this difference in regulations between two countries do have negative impacts on international trade. So if you're interested in, I think you can read up on these analytical works. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now let's continue the round with Simon, but let me add you another question that has come up that perhaps you would like to address. That is also, how do the measures compare, NTM measures compare between Europe and ASEAN? Simon, over to you.
So first, to answer the questions which were put earlier, I really liked Denise's answer, and I don't have anything to add to that. So let me endorse the three-part answer she gave to the question earlier. With respect to the differences between Europe and ASEAN with non-tariff measures, I think you will find in Europe much more resort to subsidization certainly in our database, and much more resort to export subsidization as well of different types within Europe, and within ASEAN, perhaps many more traditional non-tariff import barriers than you might see proportionally speaking within Europe. I think that would be the big distinction.
Thank you very much. Denise, do you want to add anything about differences between Europe and ASEAN?
Not at this moment. Yeah, not at this moment, no.
Okay, so then let's move on with another question. We got a very specific question at some point in the chat box. I will ask to all of you, the three speakers, to make one example each and a different one about what is a harmful NTM. Someone asked, may I know an example of a harmful NTM? And let's start perhaps with Dr. Ha.
Well, I think the traditional commercial policy tools that have been briefly mentioned by Dr. Raf, quota, for example, is considered a harmful one because it has a very clear protective nature. So it's quota.
Thank you. Denise?
Yes, I would endorse what Ha just mentioned. I would also add that a pattern that we see in the database is that developed countries tend to use more technical measures, the SPS and TBT, compared to the less developed countries. They tend to use other types of measures, for example, licenses. And that could reflect several things. It could be less transparent because if there is a condition to get a license, then it may be not a problem. But if it is not clear how you get a license, then it could be more problematic for trade. I also have to say that probably it reflects the capacity of the country for developing the legislative framework. So less developed countries probably just, it's easier to write a license rather to develop exactly what would be the standards for the product or the processing on how to check that, and then have the quality system available, the laboratories and the accreditation for the laboratories in place so that you can move more to technical measures. So in principle, I would say that relying on those measures that do not have conformity assessment could be more costly to trade in principle.
Thank you very much. Simon?
So an example I will give to round out what others have said is I'll choose an area, an NTM from government procurement. So earlier this year, the Russian government put in place a procurement regulation which required the sourcing of certain medical equipment only from Russian factories. Now, you might think that this was a rather strange thing to do in the middle of a pandemic, but nevertheless, that was what the Russian government did. It was entirely a protective measure. There was no attempt to justify it on medical security grounds.
Thank you, very clear. Now, let's devote the last few minutes of our discussion through Q&A to something that has been mentioned multiple times by participants in the chat, and also Koji Achiyama and Ralph Peters at the beginning, that is RCEP, the RCEP negotiation and the agreement. It's on the news everywhere. A lot of trade experts around the world are looking at the ASEAN and East Asia region to understand what will be the consequences. So I've asked to all speakers and also Lily, now that RCEP has been signed, what do you think is going to change? What do you expect to happen to NTMs across the 15 countries participating in RCEP in the next few years? And let's start the round with Denise.
Well, I would just mention that it's expected that countries would work more closely, and they would try to identify which are the measures that affect them the most to try to negotiate a way around that.
Thank you. Ha, what can you share?
I think the first thing I would like to mention that it's not until RCEP that provision related to NTMs has been included, because the ASEAN Trading Goods Agreement has also included some commitments, for example, on cross-notification, on the elimination of non-tariff barriers, or the establishment of an official NTM database. But as RCEP states, it's modern and comprehensive, so it views NTMs in a neutral way. This is very important. In the RCEP, the discussion is not just about the conventional quantitative restrictions, which should be eliminated, but also the legitimate NTMs, such as standards. It also touches upon conformity assessment procedures, technical cooperation, capacity building, simplifying customs procedure, transparency, etc. So the RCEP tackled both the design of the NTMs and the implementation of NTMs. So I hope that the RCEP can facilitate the application of high quality NTMs through regional cooperation, which can both serve public policy goals without creating unnecessary burdens for firms.
Thank you, Ha. Simon, yeah.
So my view on this issue with RCEP is twofold, really. RCEP puts in place some of the building blocks which will enable better public policy to be designed. So we do have provisions on transparency, we do have provisions on cooperation, and that's valuable. But I want to emphasize, and this is my second point, I think we should think of RCEP as a work in progress, and governments will have to decide in the future how much they want to build on this. Okay, so it's almost as if the members of RCEP have signed up to joining a gym, so there's a lot of intent to go and work out and to get fit and live healthily, but whether they show up at the gym and do team sports together is still to be determined, and maybe that's the right way to think about it. So there's a great opportunity here. I hope it is taken advantage of, but there are no guarantees that that opportunity will come to anything. I'm optimistic, but I'm also realistic.
Thank you for this very interesting metaphor. Lily, what can you tell us?
Thank you, Julia. Let me highlight 3 points on the RCEP. To give you an idea, the RCEP with 15 countries is about 29% of world's populations, 30% of world GDP, 27% of world's trade, and 29% of world's FDI. So it's a huge regional bloc, okay, only with the 15 countries. But to give you an idea how RCEP treat tariffs and non-tariff measures, just within 2 decades, tariffs in the regions, applied tariff rates declined half over 2000-2020. But the number of non-tariff measures increased in ASEAN more than 3 times, and in the +6 countries increased more than 5 times. I think ASEAN, the 15 member countries understands the importance of NTMs and how to work on NTMs by the fact that in the RCEP agreements, 4 chapters out of the total 20 chapters in the RCEPs, it regulates non-tariff measures, okay? It regulates conformity assessments, technical regulations, standard, it regulates SPS measures, it regulates trade remedies, it also regulates on the custom procedures and trade facilitations. So that's along the chapters 4 to chapters 7, okay? But again, I totally agree with all speakers. Now come to my third point, in the sense that implementations is the key, okay? This is the commitments of regional bloc, and all members understands there is no use of having appendixes of tariff reductions if they don't work on streamlining on NTMs. So this is a commitment of 15 countries to really work putting on place automatic licensing systems in exports and in imports, to harmonize standards and mutual recognition agreements on conformity assessments procedures. That at the regional level. So we can see if it is implemented well, we can see a lot of NTM streamlined at the regional level. But I want to highlight the efforts at regional level is important, but the actions at the national level is crucial. And this is something that I hope regional agreement can push domestic reforms, because at the end of the day, it's really at the national level that can fully implement all what has been committed at the regional level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lily. Now we are basically have 1 minute left. So before we close, I was just wondering whether, since they're still with us, Achiyama-san and Ralph, they just want to share with us anything before we close the meeting. Achiyama-san?
Thank you very much, and Julia. And yeah, again, that I'd like to thank again to all speakers and participants. And yes, as I mentioned at the opening remarks, that RCEP will be the very huge free trade region, and actually that the NTM would be the more and more important. And so I think that I hope today's discussion could be the useful for all participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ralph, what about you?
Yes, thank you very much for the great discussion we have had and the great presentations. Very briefly, I'm also think RCEP can add significantly to the NTM agenda. There are provisions, as Lily and other speakers have mentioned, for example, on transparency. Transparency alone, there was a recent OECD study. Transparency on NTMs alone can reduce trade costs by up to 25%. So that alone can have a significant impact. And I totally agree with what Simon said, that we need to make sure that the information we work so hard on is really can be used by the traders. And here that has to be really user-friendly, because the big companies, they often have their own ways to find the information, but it's the small and medium-sized enterprises that are really disproportionately affected by lack of transparency. So I think we can do a lot here. And I think RCEP does have some provisions on this, so I'm optimistic on this one. On the regulatory distance or regulatory similarity discussion, that is another very important element. As we have shown, and I shared this in the discussion forum, only a very light reform to bring the regulations a little bit closer to each other can already, again, significantly reduce the costs to trade. So if there is an effort to cooperate on regulations using international standards, mutual recognition, perhaps going as far as harmonization, that can reduce, again, trade costs significantly while keeping the protection of the consumers, the health and the safety and the environment. So that's very important. We come in the publication together with Lily and Olivier Cadeau and myself. We find that around, again, 25% of costs can be reduced with a very, very light reform. So again, congratulations to all the RCEP signatories, and thank you very much to the panelists. And we look forward to work closely, continue to work closely with ERIA, Simon Evenett on the transparency front and analyzing the effects of NTMs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that was the perfect conclusion. Also on ERIA side, I would like to thank all participants for staying with us until the very end, taking the time to discuss with us over the last 1 hour and a half. To all speakers, Denise, Ha, Simon, and also Lily. And also to all the authors of the report. I mean, you found the report in the chat box. We didn't have time to address all the questions. There was so many, so activity in the chat box, but please have a look at the report, as I think it will provide some of the answers to the questions that you have just posed. So thanks also to the authors for engaging with us in this conversation. And I think now it's probably time to close this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon, maybe one day also in person, hopefully. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
It's good to see you.
Bye.
See you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you
Bye.
for your
Bye.
Bye.